Hello, I'm Sharon Bolton and I've had two careers. For the first 20 years of my working life, I was employed by local authorities, including the Environment Agency, and latterly in financial services in the City of London. Every job I did involved writing. I had a good command of English, and that was lucky because frankly, I'd have struggled without it. As I was approaching 40, I had a big life change. I gave up my job to see if I could become a full-time writer. It wasn't easy, but my first novel was published in 2008, and my 12th, The Split, came out earlier this year. In between times, I've been on the Sunday Times bestseller list. I've won awards. My books are published in around 30 countries around the world, and one of them has been made into a Hollywood film. So both my careers have been reasonably successful, but what ties the two of them together is a love of my mother tongue and an ability to use it to communicate with other people. Or to put it another way, I was good at English. I'm often asked if I always wanted to be a writer. And my answer is always no, because for many years, it simply never occurred to me that I could do it. For one thing, when I was growing up, my best friend Susan told everyone that she was going to be the writer, and she ticked all the boxes. She was exceptionally bright, she had professional parents, she was brilliant at English. I wasn't bad, but it was obvious to everyone, me included, that she was so much better. And because she fitted the bill so perfectly, it simply never occurred to me that I could be a writer too. So I took the scenic route. I studied drama at university, and when I finished, I didn't have the courage to try to get a job in theatre, so I went to work for a local authority in their tourism and leisure department. I went to Rhyl, which has since been described as one of the most disgusting seaside resorts on earth. I'm sure that has nothing to do with the work that I did there, because I was part of a team whose job it was to persuade people to visit Rhyl, and once they were there, to spend their money in its leisure facilities. Mainly, that persuasion took a written form. I had to design posters, brochures, and leaflets. I had to write articles for local newspapers and for specialist magazines. And I had to write press releases and advertisement copy. And these had to be fit for purpose. They were judged by the public and by the press and by the council, who were our ultimate bosses. And I learned something very quickly at age 21. When you only have a few words to convey a message, such as on a poster or in a newspaper ad, those words have to work very hard. Each one of them has to count. Now, I had no on-the-job training. Nobody ever taught me how to write a press release, which is actually a very specific document. But because I'd studied English at a fairly advanced level, I was able to read press releases that others had written, break them down into their constituent parts, understand what purpose each part was serving, and most importantly, reproduce them in my own words. I want to share something with you now, just briefly, that you may have heard before. It's a writing tool that's very well known, probably because it's so very useful. I use it to this day whenever I'm writing something that is intended to persuade. And I had 6 honest serving men. They taught me all I knew. Their names were what and where and when and why and how and who. What's your piece of writing about? What's its central message? Who should be interested? Who is it aimed at? Who's involved? Why is it happening? Why should the reader be interested? Where and when did it happen, or will it happen? How can people get more involved? If these 6 questions are answered, then your piece of writing will be doing its job. So when you're employed by local authority, as I was back then, there's an awful lot of report writing. The public sector, back in those days, was quite different to the private sector. In the private sector, I think you could wing it a bit more. But in a local authority, all I's had to be dotted and T's crossed. I was constantly being told to put it in writing, so I had to be able to write. Now, I think things have relaxed a bit since then, but the public sector, that employs around half of the working age population, still sets great store by the written word. We might be writing emails instead of memos, but the principles are the same. The ability to communicate clearly and effectively with people all around us is as important now as it was then. Equally important is the ability to read and understand, sometimes to challenge what other people have written. If you're a good and experienced reader, you'll find this much easier. The good communicators are the ones who get ahead, the ones who are trusted and relied upon. It doesn't really matter whether most of your communication is in writing or in speaking. A knowledge of your mother tongue, of English in most of our cases, is key to that. So throughout my 20s and early 30s, I was employed mainly in the public sector. My last proper job was in the city. I was head of communications in a mutual insurance company that was fighting for its survival. For 3 years, we were continually trying to persuade others of the value of our role. And most of what we put out into the world either started with me or was passed by my desk. I was the person who did the writing. I was the acknowledged expert on putting out the message, and that gave me a lot of power and influence within the company. So I worked in the business world for 15 years, in a total of 7 different jobs, and every day I was writing. In the beginning, I probably wasn't very good, but through practice, I got better. I extended my vocabulary. I developed a style. I brushed up on the rules of grammar that the comprehensive school I went to hadn't thought important. But just to stay with that thought for a moment, the school I went to back in the 1970s didn't believe in teaching its pupils the rules of grammar. To this day, I couldn't tell you what a past participle is. These days, I think you're much luckier. Most young people now have a much better grounding in grammar than I had. But my point is this: because I'd read so much as part of my English curriculums, but also for pleasure, I could write grammatically by instinct. I couldn't have explained to you what the rules were, but I could instinctively follow them. So I was writing a lot. Producing 1,000 words in half a day became second nature. I was learning the discipline that you need if you're going to be a writer. I also got used to having people read what I'd done and tell me everything that was wrong with it and that needed to be changed. I learned how to take on board feedback and keep the whole in my style. I was learning how to be edited. Now, I'm a great believer in things happening when they're supposed to happen, because towards the end of my time in the city, I took a journalist from the Daily Mail out to lunch. He was a lovely chap. He didn't want to spend his lunchtime talking about life insurance and pensions, which is what I was promoting at the time, and neither did I, so we just got to chatting. And he told me he'd just taken a week off work to write a novel for Mills and Boon, because they paid, so he told me, £15,000 per book. And I thought, ooh, that's a lot of money. I had a big student loan at the time. I wonder if I could do that. So by the time I got home that evening, I had the plot of a Mills and Boon novel all worked out in my head. I took my laptop upstairs and I sat on my bed and I started writing this Mills and Boon novel. And it was the easiest thing in the world. It just came pouring out. Now, I never actually had a manuscript accepted by Mills and Boon. And those who know my books will probably consider that a good thing. It was disappointing at the time, but it taught me a valuable lesson. If you want to succeed as a writer, you have to write what you love reading. And I didn't love romance. I loved ghost stories, horror stories, stories in which anything could happen and usually did. So my dabbles in romantic fiction might not have brought me a publishing contract, but they did give me the writing bug. And by this time, another idea was bubbling away inside me. Now, people often ask where writers get their ideas from. And my answer is always that ideas are the easy bit. Ideas are everywhere. You just have to root them out. Very occasionally, though, ideas are thrown at you like a gift. Some years ago, my sister and her husband bought a plot of land by an old church on the moors in Lancashire. They wanted to build their dream house. But of course, when you're building next to an old church, you're also building next to a graveyard. And they arrived home one night to find human remains in their back garden. And they discovered that it's not unusual for the boundaries of old churches to move over the decades and the centuries, and for remains to pop up on the wrong side of the wall. They also discovered there's something called the 100-year rule in cases like this. If the bones are obviously more than 100 years old, they're just put back in the ground and forgotten about. But if they're less, then there might be a police investigation. Well, these were very old bones, so they were just reinterred. But it got me thinking, could there be a better place in the world to hide a body than a graveyard? And just suppose in maybe a heavy storm one night, the retaining wall of a graveyard collapses, a grave opens up, and more bodies tumble out than are supposed to be in there. So I had a feeling that this was a story that one day I would have to write. Nothing happened immediately, but by the time I was heading for my late 30s, I had a sense of a life crisis looming. I'd had enough of my job. I'd had enough of London. I wanted to become a mother and move to the country. I also wanted to see if I was ever going to do anything about writing. So 20 years ago, I gave up work. We moved to Buckinghamshire and I became a full-time writer. My first full-length book, telling the story I just talked about, that became quite a long ghost story, was finished in just about 6 months. I sent sample chapters and a synopsis to every agent in the country, and they all sent them straight back. The problem with that book, from what I could gather, was that the publishing industry at the time had no interest in stories about the supernatural. One or two writers like Stephen King could get away with it, and that was all. What the market wanted was crime. And not just any old crime, but gritty, no-nonsense, realistic crime, preferably featuring an alcoholic detective in a dysfunctional relationship. The trouble was, I never really enjoyed books like that. To be honest, I find them a bit dull, and I didn't think I could write one. What I continued to like was horror. To this day, I think there's nothing like a good ghost story. Tales of the weird and supernatural were what turned me on. But I got to wondering if maybe there was a third way. Maybe it was possible to write a story that had all the dark, creepy elements that I loved about the horror genre, but which ultimately was about good, old-fashioned human nastiness. Well, I hope so, because I'd had another idea by this time that I had a pretty good feeling about. I'd been in Aylesbury Public Library one morning, researching Scandinavian and Norse mythology, and I came across the legend of the Shetland Coonal Trowels. Who are the Coonal Trowels? Well, they're a race of men who live among humans and who pass for human, but who have various supernatural powers. They're very strong. They can live a very long time. They can hypnotize and even become invisible at twilight and early morning. But they do have one big disadvantage. They can't produce female children. So to keep their species going and maintain their uniqueness, they have to steal a human wife. When the baby is born, the mother dies. Now that's the legend that I found in Aylesbury Public Library. And I just love the idea of this group of men living among ordinary men, passing for human, but all the time preying upon their human neighbours and stealing away women. And I started to wonder if it could be made to work as a modern crime novel, whether the various supernatural elements of the story could be reined in enough to make it credible. Well, it took me several years to finish Sacrifice. My baby son would go down for a nap and I'd rush upstairs to the computer. If he'd been a better, more reliable sleeper in the early days, the book might have been finished long before it was, and probably would have been rejected by the entire market. Because all the time I was writing, I had huge doubts. Was I spending all this time on a story that, however well I wrote it, was just too far-fetched ever to be taken seriously? In this respect, I was incredibly lucky, because just before I was ready to send the story off to publishers, Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code took the world by storm, and it seemed to change the publishing market. Suddenly, publishers were looking for modern-day thrillers based on ancient legends, and I remember reading one day in the bookseller that the market was looking for not straight fantasy, but books with a fantastical twist. The same issue carried a reference to tapping into taste for fast-paced adventure with secretive undertones. Both of those comments seemed to describe Sacrifice very well. So armed with hope, I sent off sample chapters. Within a week, a lady from the Ampersand agency offered to represent me. I met her, liked her, And we spent the summer getting the manuscript ready for submission. It sold quite quickly to publishers all over the world. It was made into a Hollywood film and is generally considered to be a very successful first novel. So that's how I went from working in communications for large, often public sector companies to being a self-employed full-time writer. And the one constant throughout both my careers has been a love of words and of the power they have to persuade and move other people. Now, I've been asked to talk a little bit about the skills and qualities needed for a career as a novelist. And on this, most writers I know would agree. You have to read a lot, you have to think a lot, and you have to write a lot. Most writers read massively. I was the sort of child who always had a book on the go. If books weren't allowed at the table, I'd read the cornflakes packet. A love of TV dramas and films is a good sign too. It means you love stories. You need a powerful imagination. I always have another imaginary life going on in my head. I like to ask, what if? If you're curious about things, if you notice things that are a little out of the ordinary, if you construct fantasies about people you meet and situations you find yourself in, the chances are you have the imagination to be a writer. And finally, you need to be able to write. You need to hone your craft. I did it for nearly 20 years through my job. I wasn't writing fiction, but I was perfecting the art of using words to communicate. So if one day you want to make your living from writing, you have to start now. Nothing you write will be wasted. Do I recommend the writer's life? Not for any of you, not yet. And why is that? Well, to start off, it's lonely. I spend most of my day at my desk staring at a computer screen. If I didn't have a dog and a family, my human interaction would be close to zero. Now that's fine for me in my 50s, but in my 20s, 30s, I would have struggled. Also, we work on long projects. A book can take a year or longer from start to finish, and for most of that time, I'll get no feedback at all from my publisher. I won't know whether I'm creating a work of genius or the biggest load of rubbish ever consigned to paper. And by the time I'm getting towards the end, I'm pretty convinced it's the latter, but I still have to keep going. Rejection and criticism are constant, from the editor's reports, which are constructive and helpful, to the one-star Amazon reviews that are not. Perfect strangers tell me on a regular basis via Twitter that my books suck. And some of them expect me to be grateful for their honest feedback. It doesn't pay particularly well. The median annual income for a professional author is £10,500 per annum, which is well below minimum wage. Fewer than 15% of writers make their living solely from writing. Most have another job as well. And you have to put yourself out there. Unless you're prepared to be completely honest in your writing, to share things about yourself that are deeply personal, you probably won't produce anything worth reading. For all these reasons and more, it's not a young person's job. But that's not to say it won't be for you in time. So my advice to anyone who thinks they do want to be a professional writer is read as much as possible. Read every genre. Write as much as possible. A job in which you have to write is ideal. Write for a hobby, nothing will be wasted. Engage with the publishing industry on social media. Get to know who the influential editors and agents are. You might become a book blogger. A lot of bloggers go on to become writers. Decide whether you want to be traditionally published or whether you want to publish your own books. There are advantages to both routes. Research the process, whichever you choose. There's loads of advice on the internet for new writers. On the plus side, the process is relatively simple and easy to understand. On the downside, it's very, very competitive. And finally, start collecting. Story ideas, ideally, maybe a brilliant title or two, maybe just a few words of description. I had a sentence in my head for years before I was able to put it into a book, and it was the sepulchral blooms of an ancient wisteria. I finally managed it. J.K. Rowling talks about falling in love with a word in a Thomas Hardy novel that she knew one day she'd use in a book. That word was Dumbledore. So that's me finished. I think I've just about come to the end of my 20 minutes, and I believe there are some questions.
There certainly are. That's fantastic. We've got a question. Right, so let's get to it. What is the best book you wrote?
Oh, that's so hard. Probably, I always like to say a book called Daisy in Chains, which was about my 8th book. I think that's the most original idea. It's about a woman who is in love with a serial killer. I think technically it's my best. It performed the worst commercially. It sold the fewest copies. So I've learned not to trust my own instincts when it comes to my own books. And similarly, books that I haven't been particularly proud of, that I don't think are particularly good or original, have done quite well.
Kind of interesting, isn't it? Because what you think is good is not necessarily what other people think is good.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's interesting. Right, we have got a lot of questions here. There's one thing that I want, well, here's a question, because you spoke about now that you're an author, but before that you worked in jobs and you had to write press releases or brochures. And so you were always using English. And one of the questions that we've got is what other careers involve English? And also, let's just understand the importance of those words. Like for the jobs that you did previously, the wording is absolutely has to be important, like you said in your presentation, because of the message you need to get across. So what other careers do involve English?
Very few don't. There are very few careers I can think of where you don't have to communicate with other people, usually in writing, but not always. And you have to be able to make your case clearly and concisely. And it's surprising how many people can't do that. Really, really intelligent people, super qualified, who don't have that thorough grounding in their mother tongue, struggle to put their point across. They write paragraphs that are rambling, that are all over the place. Their emails don't quite make sense. So, you know, it's not just about, forget English, it's just about being able to communicate and to make your words understood. And you know, there are lots of careers where an ability a love of English is very useful, and publishing is an obvious one. My editor, with whom I work very closely, studied English at university. So a lot of people who have English degrees go into publishing, either as editors or as publicists. Any number of careers.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. And like you said, English is our language, and words are important. And I can tell you that from my side, so the jobs that I do, now I'm an outreach manager. I run sessions in schools for students like yourselves, and I teach people about how to write a good CV, how to write a cover letter, and it always comes up, being able to write a short, concise paragraph that is engaging is what will help your CV stand out. So knowing how to use those words is important. We've got another couple of questions. 2 questions. How many books have you written, and how do you recommend the best way for students to follow publishers on social media?
Okay, I have published 12 books. I have another 3 in the pipeline waiting to be published. The best way to follow publishers on social media is to look for the hashtags. Twitter is probably still the favorite place to find them. So go onto Twitter and look for the books that are top of the charts at the moment, and find out who's talking about them. Follow the hashtags, you know, the thriller books, romance books, search for publishers, search for editors. Once you start following a few, you see the conversations that they're having amongst themselves, you'll soon start to find the others. So Twitter first. Instagram is getting increasingly important.
Brilliant. And we've got another question, which is for any student that has been on any other lesson that I've helped host this week, you'll have heard me talk about it and you're probably bored of it by now, but I hope you're not, because it's a really important one. And Sharon did touch upon it in her presentation. The question is, what do you do when you've been criticized for your writing? Do you have tips on how to build your confidence up again?
Oh, I wish. I think the first thing to do is ask yourself whether the feedback, let's call it that, has merit. If it's coming from somebody who shares your interest in the piece of work working, like for instance with me that would be my editor, then I have to then she is as vested as I am in getting the book out. So I have to accept that whatever she says, even if I don't like it, will have some merit. So ask yourself whether the criticism has merit and whether you can take on board any of it and make your piece of work better. Don't necessarily assume that every piece of feedback is valid, though. Sometimes it can just be a matter of opinion, and your opinion is as valid as anyone's. As to all the negative stuff, I think it hurts less and less as time goes on. When my first book came out, I was paranoid about the 1-star Amazon reviews because people can be mean. Now I don't even bother to read them. On Amazon, I would read the 3-star reviews, the ones that are sort of in the middle, because they are the people who liked the book but had some issues with it. So the issues are what I need to read, because that's how I can perhaps make my next book better.
That's a really good point. Reading those bits when people have issues with something, and then working out how to get better at it. And we've talked about this through other lessons, and I'll say it again. Resilience is a really important trait to have at the moment, or actually any time in your career, because you will come up against criticism. And like Sharon said, some of it is valid, some of it is not. Where is the criticism coming from, and what can you use it for? Can you use it to improve? Can you use it to get better? It depends. If it is just somebody's opinion and they don't like what you've written, or they don't like you, or they don't want to give you a job, that's fine. You just move on and you go and find the people that do want you and in Sharon's case, that do want to read her book. And remember, she said that her favorite book is not the one that sold the most copies. So it may be her favorite, but not her readers. So everybody has different opinions, and it will always be different. I've got another couple of questions. Do you have any regrets about leaving behind the corporate world? And then what about if your mother tongue is not English?
Oh gosh, do I have any regrets? This is going to sound so trivial. I miss getting dressed up in the morning and putting makeup on and going out. I do miss that, because I don't need nice clothes anymore. A lot of writers work in their pajamas. I miss the human contact to an extent. I enjoy going to my publishers for meetings to sort of thrash around ideas. But I probably don't want to do it that much anymore. So I think it's about the stages of life. In my 20s, I would have been too young to move to this sort of life, to move away from the corporate life. In my 30s, I would still have been too young. So I do think it's the decision to become a full-time writer has to be taken carefully. But no, I don't really. There are things I miss, but I don't regret it. This is the right thing for me now.
There you go. Then we've got 1 minute left to answer this very difficult question. But it's not difficult. What if your mother tongue is not English? That
Oh,
shouldn't be a
right.
barrier, should it?
Right. There are writers who write extremely successfully, both in fiction, they write poetry, they write non-fiction in a language that is not their first. So it does happen, but even if your mother tongue isn't English, it's probably more important then that you become as good as you can be at communicating with the people around you, because you have an obstacle that you have to overcome. But take heart from the fact that you know 2 languages, possibly 3 languages. And most of us who are native English speakers can't speak 2 languages. So you have already proven your ability to learn and to assimilate and to achieve. So that in itself should give you confidence.
Perfect. Right. It is 2:15, so we do have to end here. But Sharon, thank you so much for coming and presenting today. I really enjoyed that session. It's great to hear about how things work on that side of being a writer. I mean, you always look at it as if it's something, how would you say, it's like fabulous and glorious, but there are obviously difficulties behind it, but you enjoy it, which is great. Thank you also to the students that have come along today, that have listened, that have taken part, that have asked questions. We've got a thank you there from the John Hampden students. So lots of people will have taken away lots of useful things from this today. So thank you very much, everybody, and thank you for all taking part and engaging and making it good. I will say goodbye now. If you are on the next lesson, I'm going to cut out of this one and then I will restart the session and we'll be on the next lesson. Sharon, thank you very much for today. Much appreciated.